Episode number 2. Today I've invited Stanton Friedman to talk about his experience writing the book Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. We get into some very interesting discussion about how the U.S. government is covering up some evidence about UFOs and the existence of aliens, and how they may be even visiting our planet. And we also discuss the importance of continuing to push on for the release of information to the public. I will say you have to forgive the quality of the audio on this. This was recorded via phone call, but it's still an interesting conversation to say the least. So without wasting any more time, let's jump right into the conversation.
Okay, Stanton, thank you for joining us today on Deviatus. I'm really
pleased to do so, I think.
Thank you. I hope so. I'm really interested in the book that you and Kathleen Martin have coming out in September, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. I did read an excerpt about your book, which indicated the U.S. government has gone to great measure to cover up some evidence of alien presence here. Without giving away too much from the book, can you tell me about some of the specific evidence you're referring to?
Well, and you're right, I am very limited as to what I can say because my publisher says, don't you dare say a lot until we get the book out on the bookshelves so people can run right out and buy it, you know.
Right.
But what we've done, Kathy and I have done other books before. One was Science Was Wrong. Another was Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. And we've touched on this whole question of the cosmic Watergate. I talk about it in my book, Flying Saucers and Science. The kicker here is this time we've gone for looking at some of the people who have been prominent in the, I'll call it the anti-ufology scene, and trying to make sense out of why would such smart people say such stupid things. And so we'll be looking, for example, at Dr. Edward U. Condon, who spent $539,000 of taxpayer money on the University of Colorado study, and on Dr. Donald Menzel, Harvard University astronomer, and on Mr. Philip Klass. Now, all these people have said utterly ridiculous things about flying saucers in general and cover-ups in particular. And so there is a need to expose this stuff for what it is. Even though they're prominent and smart people, they're all dead now. They can't sue me. I guess that means. But we go into detail and try to make sense. We clearly demonstrate that they have told falsehoods, that they have said things that simply were not true. And they were too smart not to know that they weren't telling the truth. You know what I mean? There's a difference between somebody who is ignorant and really doesn't know that enough so you have to say he was lying because maybe he didn't know he was lying. But in the case of these three people, these were very smart people. And it's beyond reason how vehemently anti they were. So that's why in the title we talk about fiction. We replace the fiction of what they've said. I can give you one example. Philip Klass, Senior Avionics Editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology, who said, every sighting has a prosaic explanation. And we got into it about the Operation Majestic 12 documents. And he tried to put forth the crazy notion, and I'll explain why it's crazy, that the Cutler-Twining memo, a brief memo which mentions MJ-12. He said it was obviously a phony because it was written in the large pica type. And the National Security Council used only the elite type, and he had 10 documents to prove it. Now, that sounds pretty strong, doesn't it? Well, it turns out he also challenged me. In order to sweeten the pot, I will give you $100 each for every genuine memo from the NSC done in the same size and style pica type as was used in this Cutler-Twining memo, up to a maximum of 10. And I had 60 days. Well, as it turns out, I later discovered Phil had never been to the Eisenhower Library, and we're talking about that time frame. I had spent weeks pica type, and I was going there anyway, so I dug out 14 documents. Before doing that, I went to my files just to see how far off he was. I immediately pulled 20 NSC documents done in large pica type. They didn't meet all his criteria. There were other limitations. But so I know they were using pica type. But anyway, when I went there, it's easy to distinguish between the two, pica and elite. So I pulled out 14 documents, made copies for him, and sent him an invoice for $1,000, $100 each. And I wish he hadn't put such a limit. But anyway, he paid me $1,000 for proving him wrong. But he told everybody about challenging me and nobody about paying me. and if you look at the papers, and all three have papers at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia, and Kathy and I have been there, and we quote at length from these. And, it was perfectly clear that he didn't know what he was talking about. But the important thing is there is no Stanton Friedman file in the class papers, although we corresponded for 20 years, which is rather interesting, I would say. Selective, is that a better word?
I really hope I can help publicize the fact that he paid you here. That would be great.
Well, he got very angry at me when I included a copy of his check in one of my books. Threatened to sue me and so forth, and so his father was an attorney. He knows how to write threatening letters, And so I told him, Phil, you sent me a check. I Xeroxed it. I took the check to the bank. They cashed it. I can do whatever I darn please with the Xerox copy. And he shut up, but he was mad. He didn't want anybody to know. And, what I'm saying is I try to get the facts in hand before putting my mouth in gear. And that's just one example of many with him. And with Menzel, it turned out, as I point out in my book, Top Secret Magic, M-A-J-I-C, it came as a total shock to me and the whole rest of the UFO community to find that Menzel had he said this to Jack Kennedy, mind you, Menzel had a longer continuous association with the National Security Agency, Mr. Snowden's favorite agency. 30 years of anybody in the country, and that when we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. They were on a first-name basis, sometimes had breakfast together. Jack was in the Boston area, and Menzel was at Cambridge and Harvard. And he wrote 3 anti-UFO books. And nobody knew about his government connection. And also, it turns out, he was a world-class cryptologist. Nobody knew that either. It shows up in an unpublished autobiography. He's dead. I was the only one, apparently, who went to look at his papers. I found a letter from an attorney to one of the other members of MJ-12 saying, thanks for helping me get Donald cleared of these charges of his being not just unpatriotic, but, a threat to the security of the country and stuff like that. I called the lawyer. He told me there were 1,000 pages of stuff at Harvard, how to get permission from 3 different people to go to Harvard to look at his papers, including his wife, incidentally, who said, and I believe her, that she didn't know anything about his classified activities. But it turns out he was up to his ears in classified activities for at least 30 years, and nobody knew it. His first book was published, it was translated into Russian. One wonders. Spread the good word. There's nothing to flying saucers. So, but it took some digging. And I've had people say he couldn't lead a double life. Well, I would mention 3 names, Burgess, Philby, and McLean. These were 3 British intelligence agency guys who were spies for the Russians working for MI5. You got to be careful, and that's leading a double life for sure. You can't allow anything to be said that would point back to you as a source of the information because you're on our side, right? Those are just 3 guys. And with Menzel, I have to admit that before I did this digging, I'd had one run-in with him. It was crazy. I was at Harvard. I was going to be speaking that evening to an engineering alumni group. I called in the middle of the day to invite him to the lecture, and I said, "This is Stanton Friedman." "Oh, I know all about you." "Oh, you saw my congressional testimony next to yours?" I said. He said, "You can't be a scientist and believe in flying saucers," at which I laughed because it's such a stupid remark. He got angry, and I said, "Look, Dr. Menzel, I didn't call to argue with you. I called out of courtesy. I'm speaking on your campus. I have no idea how much publicity they've put out. Well, of course I won't be there." So I told the story that night, incidentally. So it was a complete shock to me and everybody else in the community that here was the guy who always said there was nothing to flying saucers and who had done all kinds of classified work for the FBI, for the CIA, for, all this cryptology stuff. I wound up admiring the man. He served his country. I worked under security for 14 years. I can appreciate it. It's not always easy. And I certainly appreciate the fact that his wife wouldn't have known what he was doing. I never told my wife anything classified. It would be stupid. I'd break the law, too, but more than that, you can't control what your wife says. Maybe some people can. But I can.
Well, let me ask you this. There seems to be just a ton of compelling evidence out there. Why does there seem to be kind of an underwhelming amount of journalistic research covering all this information?
Well, that's a very good question. As a matter of fact, one of the dozen PhD theses about UFOs that I reference in my book, Top Secret Magic, and there are more now, it came out a number of years ago, dealt with press coverage of the UFO subject and had scathing remarks. This is Dr. Herbert Strintz. He's deceased now, too. He wound up being chairman of the journalism department at Drake University in Iowa, and he had scathing comments to make about the adequacy, the failure to check the right sources, to do their homework, all the rest of that. And, all I can say is somebody was operating at a high level to say, this is a subject we want to put the kibosh on. And it's understandable when you find out later, much later, that, for example, the NSA eventually, after a Freedom of Information Action suit, released 156 pages of top secret Umbra NSA UFO stuff. Wow! The only trouble was you could read one sentence per page. Everything else was whited out. Got dozens of pages of top secret Umbra CIA stuff, all blacked out. So anybody who says there isn't a cover-up doesn't know what he's talking about. But it is standard practice. If you've got a highly classified operation going on, you have to do everything possible to deceive your enemies, and that means deceiving the press, because you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies. They read the newspapers, they listen to the radio. So obviously there was a policy dating back, to prove that. General Carol Bolender was an Air Force general who was an engineer on a lunar excursion module program which landed on the moon in 1968, I guess. And he was asked, because the Condon people said we should close Project Blue Book, it's not contributing anything to science or intelligence, and I tend to agree with that. But anyway, he had no previous connection with it. So he wrote a memo, which we didn't see until 10 years later, that wound up closing Project Blue Book at the end of 1969. In the memo, he said, this is an astonishing statement, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP, Joint Army-Navy Air Force Publication 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. That's an extraordinary statement, because for umpteen years the Air Force has said, all we had going was Project Blue Book and didn't find anything useful and so forth. Now, 2 paragraphs later they say, if we close Project Blue Book, which was closed because of General Bolender's memo, the public won't have a place to report sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security would continue to be investigated using procedures designed for that purpose. Now, here again, we have a picture totally at odds with what the public was being told year in, year out. Nothing of UFOs after Blue Book was closed. That's the end of it. Don't worry about a thing. Well, I called General Bolander because I was very curious about this statement. And I asked him, I told him that I had a clearance for 14 years, very interested in the subject, was very interested in his memo. It sounds to me like you're saying that there are two separate communication channels for UFO data. One for sightings which could affect national security, and I told him I'd had a report 3 weeks earlier about a saucer that went down the runway at a SAC base where nuclear weapons were stored. And I said, I presume that would be automatically a cause for national security concern. He agreed. Mm-hmm. I said, then if my wife and I are driving down the road and we see a flying saucer, big deal. It happens all the time. He agreed with me. And you can't interview him because he's dead. But now, the question is, where did those reports go? Big question. I'd say Operation Majestic 12 because of the memo we got, and I've discussed all the objections in Top Secret Magic. But what I'm saying is the press has paid little attention, has almost never devoted as much effort to finding out the truth as they would on about a good baseball game, for goodness sakes. Now, many people don't know. You realize the United States government, within 2 weeks of Pearl Harbor, established a censorship bureau, appointed a man as head of censorship. And one word they couldn't use, for example, in the press was uranium. Perhaps not surprising. Another one was the Japanese Fugo balloons, where they were sent across from the Pacific and supposed to cause fires all over the United States and so forth. We didn't want the Japanese to know whether they were successful or not. Generally not. I think 2 people were killed by them. So you couldn't use the term. So it may be that there was a policy that we don't know about that was established behind the scenes. Just, look at them. People think, well, everything the government does is out in the open, isn't it? No, sorry. Lockheed developed a stealth plane. $10 billion they spent over 10 years, all under security. The separation of uranium isotopes was a big part of the Manhattan Project. They built a mile-long facility that used 5% of all the electricity produced in the United States to separate uranium isotopes. The U-235 is a little lighter than U-238, so it goes through a little faster, and pretty soon you're starting to enrich. You start off with 0.7%. You wind up with 80-90%. But it was a very large, expensive, totally classified effort. And people just don't get it sometimes. We knew the U-2's history wouldn't be very long. It was going to be shot down some point when it started flying over the Soviet Union. It was, of course, violating international law because it was over Soviet airspace. But we knew the Russians couldn't fly as high as it was flying. And they finally shot one down. But before Gary Powers was shot down, we were working on spy satellite, Corona spy satellite. There were 12 failures in a row. They kept going. Number 13 got more data about Soviet military installations than all the U-2 flights that had preceded it. Mm-hmm. Interesting. The public was not told about Corona for 30 years. Big project.
You bring up an interesting point about the media coverage. I mean, you've been speaking on UFOs since 1967, if I
yes.
Remember from your bio correctly. What additional changes have you noticed in the way journalists and the mass media cover UFO sightings?
Well, a couple of them. One, there seems to be recognition now, which you didn't find very often just after the war, that governments don't always tell the truth. How about that? Secondly, I think the press has recognized that the way the scientific data is moving, such as from the Kepler satellite, which is finding planets, by the thousand. 50 years ago, plenty of people were saying we're the only solar system, we have the only solar system in the whole galaxy. Now it looks like a good number is 1 to 1.6 planets per star. What that means is that within 100 light years of here, which is just down the street, the galaxy is 100,000 light years across, Within just 100 years, there are 10,000 stars, which implies at least 10,000 planets. Now, maybe only 10% have life. Okay, that's still a big number, and they're not far away. So
Right.
the general community has recognized that notions of our specialness. Also, not too many people believe that the world wasn't created until 4004 BC. And if you said 4,000,000,004, you might not get any arguments, but 4004, some of the fundamentalists believe that. We have all kinds of data that say it's very old. And also we now know that even though the nearest star to the sun is 4.3 light years away, there are plenty of stars that have nearest neighbors less than a light year away. In the famous Betty and Barney Hill case, the abduction in New Hampshire, in our book Captured, there was a star map observed and an awful lot of work was done on it without going into the details. Still, it turns out that the two stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, that's the constellation of Reticulum, the net, that means in Latin, I'm told, not that I speak Latin, they're only 39.3 light years from here, but much more important, they're only an eighth of a light year apart from each other. So each star is visible to people on planets around the other one all day long. And you could certainly find out a heck of a lot more information than we can because we're so isolated, if you will, from other stars. So that changes the picture. Just like in the early 1920s, thanks to the Hubble telescope, the guy involved with that, Mr. Hubble, we found out that there was more than one galaxy. We thought there was only one galaxy. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting story how he discovered that, but it was pretty clear. And so times change, understanding changes. And also, we know something very important that's in the picture, our knowledge of nuclear fusion. We didn't know that's how the sun produced its energy. It was just a mass of burning gas, right? Well, in 1938, we figured that wasn't right. Now, what does this mean? If you go to nuclear fusion, which is what goes on in H-bombs, I worked on a study of fusion propulsion for deep space travel back in 1962. And the conclusion was, if you got the dough, you can go. It's taken an awful lot of money. But my point is that suddenly the notion of star travelers is reasonable. The first H-bomb released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. A big bomb in 1944, 8 years earlier, released the energy of 10 tons of TNT. So that's an enormous jump. And incidentally, the Russians set off one, released the energy of 57 million tons of TNT. So there's definitely a change. And look at the nuclear navy. If I had told you a lot of years ago that you could make submarines that could go around the world underwater, you'd say you're crazy. The submarines during World War II could stay under for 24 hours maybe, but they needed air for the diesel engines. We now have submarines that have literally gone around the world underwater without coming to the surface. That's fission. We also have nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that can operate for 18 years without refueling. So there's a recognition that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way, something we didn't have full appreciation of not too many years ago. We're the smart guys. We know all there is to know, nothing new, et cetera, et cetera. One of my books with Kathleen Marden is Science Was Wrong, and that's one of the things they were very wrong about. The people said the greatest astronomer in the United States said man would never fly any distance in a vehicle. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. So it takes a while for the press to catch up. But I think they're doing a better job. We have a newer generation of people who are aware that maybe it's okay to talk about this. And I haven't had a heckler in my lecture for years. I've given over 750 lectures and a total of 11 hecklers, 2 of whom were drunk. And I'm told you'll get that many if you talk about sports, religion, politics, I don't. talk about this.
Well, we've certainly come a long way in a considerably short amount of time.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really admire about you is your willingness to call people out publicly, but most people don't really have the fortitude to do so. Do you think that we're so worried as a society by our appearance and status that we're unwilling to face ridicule for our beliefs?
Well, I will say this. At the end of my lectures, I ask how many people here believe they've seen what I would describe as a flying saucer, having given a detailed description. And just raise your hand. We didn't let the CIA in. I'm just going to point and count, try to relax people. And I do that. And the hands go up slowly and to my left, and I go 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time I get over far to my right, 10% of the people have raised their hands, which comes as a surprise to all those people. And I've had crowds as big as 2,000. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down. Not too surprising, I guess. And I tried a little experiment in a class. I had the professor count the votes. I had the students vote with their eyes closed. I won't guarantee none of them cheated. I'm just telling you what we asked. 80%, I asked the question, how many of you think most people don't believe in flying saucers? 80% raised their hands. Then I asked that audience with their eyes closed, how many of you do believe in flying saucers? 80%. And when people come to my table, they got to tell me their sighting. They want an autograph on a book or whatever. And I asked, did you report it? No. Why not? They'd think I was some kind of a nut. So fear of ridicule was a very powerful influence on people. I mean, I'm just a dumb old physicist. I'm not a psychiatrist, but it appears that is a dominant concern. I even had a couple afterward. This was a dinner and a talk, and a woman says to the man later, how come you raised your hand when he asked who'd had a sighting? Well, I did. You never told me about it. No, we were just married. I figured you'd laugh at me, so I didn't say anything. That's a couple, for goodness sakes. So, fear of ridicule is something that you can use very well to have people keep their mouths shut.
So what motivates you to be so determined in your efforts still?
Well, a couple of things. One, I worked on far-out advanced propulsion systems, so I'm excited by the technology. And when I see all the changes that have been made within my lifespan, that excites me. Secondly, I learned from a fifth-grade school teacher, if you're going to take on authority, you better have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. She had said that the whole solar system stands still and the planets move around the sun. And I just read in our 50-cent a volume encyclopedia a long time ago that the whole solar system is moving around the center of the galaxy. And I spoke up. No, that's not true. And she gave me a hard time. Well, okay, I didn't fight with teachers. The next day I brought in the encyclopedia, and she reluctantly admitted, well, maybe it was true that the solar system revolves around the center of the galaxy. But the basic rule I learned was have facts in hand, or don't put your mouth in gear. And so I've enjoyed that. Secondly, I'm a born ham. I like being on the stage, and I was worried the first year I was speaking that somebody would destroy my whole argument by having facts that I didn't know anything about and so forth. It never happened. And so I get a kick out of it. Many people appreciate the fact that I'm presenting data they've never heard of, never seen. I mean, I talk about the largest study of flying saucers ever done for the United States Air Force, Project Blue Book, Special Report 14. And 98% of the people have never heard of it, probably 99%. And it showed that 21.5% of the sightings couldn't be explained, completely separate from those listed as insufficient information. This shocks people. Even though the Secretary of the Air Force is quoted in the press release that went out when this volume was completed as even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. A total lie. So people, I am impressed by the fact that people appreciate the fact that we're putting facts on the table, checkable facts. I give references. And yeah, I like a little humor. I refer to SETI, S-E-T-I's, which is supposed to be Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, as silly effort to investigate. And then I demonstrate why that is a silly effort. To assume aliens are sending us messages using technology appropriate to us. Our first long-distance radio signal was 1901, Newfoundland, Marconi. Nobody's ahead of us. You know, are they using AM or FM? Not a bit of data has been provided that indicates anybody's sending signals. We got all kinds of data that indicates beings are coming here. I won't say humans, I'll say humanoids, okay? But all the abduction cases, all the physical trace cases from around the world, there's an enormous amount of data that most people aren't aware exists. So I get a kick out of providing that and having them respond well to that.
So how often do you, show people who call themselves scientists or researchers evidence and refuse to acknowledge that evidence?
Well, certainly none of them stand up and say, gee, I guess I was wrong about that. And I will admit that some of the professors won't come to my lectures, and I'm more doing conventions than I am colleges anymore, because it took work to get college lectures. I had to do mailings to 1,000 colleges, and follow up on the 8 that booked me and get more piggyback talks, as I call them. But I find, and I've spoken to engineering societies, to sections of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, physics colloquium, and I do try a little trick. When I'm warned that Dr. Jones thinks you're full of baloney beforehand by one of the students, I'll run through some things, ask them, everybody's aware of the electromagnetic submarine, for example, or the nuclear rocket system, put a sketch up on the board, and usually nobody is, of course. Then I ask them a couple of questions. What's the numerical value of 1G? 9.8 meters per second squared. They all know that. I said, well, how about in terms that we use for other things, like cars? It turns out a car at 1G is 21 miles per hour per second. I also ask them what's the speed of light, 300,000 kilometers a second. We don't measure anything else that way. The real question then I say is, okay, how long does it take at 1G to get to the speed of light? Multiple choice question. It's either 1,000, 100 years, 10 years, 1 year. I'm going to think it's 1,000 to go down the list. Almost invariably, fewer than 2% think it's 1 year. So suddenly the students will realize they're in the real world, their professors don't know what they're talking about. So I'll admit I get a certain charge out of that. But then one of the 11 hecklers stood up after my lecture at State University of New York, Cortland, and said, I've never heard so much nonsense in one night in my life. Great way to start. So fortunately I said, can you be a bit more specific than that, please? You said that Betty and Barney Hill were taken to Zeta Reticuli and back in 2 hours. I said, no, sir. What I said, they were taken on board a craft. They didn't go anywhere. 2 more questions just like that, equally unknowledgeable. Finally, somebody in the audience said, can you answer some sensible questions, please? This guy gets up and walks out. He's well-dressed, well-spoken. I said, I'll answer your question, but who was that? Obviously, I irked him. He was a professor of physics. He hadn't heard what I said at all. He wasn't prepared to listen to something that was outside the scope of what he knew.
And he probably didn't offer his own questions, did he? No.
Look, I don't worry about debunkers anymore. I'll take on anybody. I've done debates. Seth Shostak and I have debated on Coast to Coast Radio, for example. I got 57% of the vote. He got 33%, and 10% said, I don't know who won. Dr. Michael Shermer, head of the Skeptics Society, he and I debated on Coast to Coast again. I got 80% of the vote. My team won a debate at Oxford University Debating Society. We got 60% of the vote, which came as a surprise, I found, to many pro-UFO people that were there. They thought I was going to get clobbered, my team. Look, you win debates not by just being a skillful talker, but by having your facts in hand. Facts that anybody can look up. You can't say, well, I know where the data is, but I can't tell you. I mean, that's useless. So I don't worry about other physicists. I am one. I still belong to the American Physical Society, the American Nuclear Society, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. But I'll take on anybody. They can go to my website and find out how to reach me, www.stantonfriedman.com. It lists all the books and, all that sort of stuff where I'm speaking. And, I must admit I'm slowing down a little bit. I'll be 82 in a couple of weeks. I should get some time off.
You should. A well-deserved vacation, I believe.
Well, I was just in Roswell. I gave 2 lectures, was on 2 panels, signed a lot of books. Before that, I did a program in St. Louis, and before that, a big program in Brantford, Ontario. And, I've been busy. Now I'm taking I will be at the MUFON conference in Orlando, signing the new book, incidentally, because it'll be there, even though it's not generally out. It's at the end of August. My website lists my upcoming engagements, so, they can find me. And my phone number is there, too. I don't give it out over the air because I don't want to be called during the middle of programs.
Well, what kind of encouragement would you provide anyone interested in, beginning research, real research into evidence of alien life or visits from extraterrestrials?
Well, do your homework is the first thing. My books have extensive bibliographies. Like I say, Top Secret Magic includes a list of 10 PhD theses about UFOs, if you want to get technical, and a lot of other reference material that most people don't even know exists. That's the first thing. Second, I think you have to formulate what is it you're trying to determine. In other words, there's a difference between saying what color, where do aliens originate? That's a very different question from saying, are there aliens visiting here? I mean, when somebody pulls up in your front door, if you can't see his license plate, you don't know where the car originated. No. And we don't have any. Also, I think people need to be more aware of how many secrets are being covered up. It's not unusual to be covering up material. Look, the military intelligence budget of the United States 3 years ago, according to the Washington Post, was $52.6 billion. That's a lot of money just for intelligence work. I mean, that's not buying you tanks and planes and ships, that's people and stuff. So there's a huge classified world out there. And anybody who thinks, I've had professors say, well, with the internet and YouTube, you can't keep anything secret. That's absolute nonsense. Talk about physicists. I had a couple tell me, Stan, look, if saucers crashed at Roswell, and I'm the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident, there would have been an article in the Physical Review within 6 months. That's absolute nonsense. Governments can and do keep secrets routinely. And I'm not blaming them. I'm not pushing for a disclosure. Because there is a national security aspect. Suppose we've learned from saucer wreckage more about new materials and how saucers work and stuff. Should we put it out on the table if the Russians and Chinese don't put out what they know? I don't think so. It's, in this world, this year, we will spend $1 trillion on things military, we nice guy earthlings. Think of how many kids died of starvation yesterday. That's a pretty strange planet. I think from an alien viewpoint, we're a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare. So anything I can do to get people to open up their vision about what we do, about what others are doing, is something I should be doing. That's what keeps me young.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this. It's definitely been a thought-provoking conversation. I know you're a really busy person, and we're kind of on our time here, but Thanks again so much for your time today. If you wouldn't mind telling our audience again where they can find you and maybe some information about your past or upcoming books, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, my website is www.stantonfriedman, FRIEDMAN.com. It lists my books. It tells you where I'll be speaking, tells you how to reach me. I'll give out my email address, fspphys@bellalliant.net. That's BELLALIANT.net. So I'm easy to find.
Great, and I will include all of that information in my show notes. Once again, thank you, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Bye-bye.
I want to send a really big thank you to Stanton Friedman for his appearance on our show this week. He really was a super nice guy to talk to. He was more than forthcoming with a lot of the information that he had. You can find this episode's show notes at deviatus.com/Friedman. That's FRIEDMAN. If you'd like to keep this conversation going, please get in touch with me on deviatus.com, on Facebook, or if you'd like to chat with me on Twitter or Instagram, you can find me at DeviatusPod. Until next time, thanks for listening.